this episode of That Kingsville Podcast, we have a very, very special guest this week. Local, let's call him celebrity, right?
Absolutely.
Historian, educator, coach,
friend.
Right. Bob Lynch joins us, sits down, talks about his life, everything that he's had to do with basketball, documenting the community and his influences. So,
just as a teaser, Michael Jackson potentially learning the moonwalk in Kingsville.
Yeah, shit. You picked that as like how many other things did we talk about that we could have just used? But that is a good one. That's a good one, right? You know, the creation of rock and roll in the Kingsville or the Windsor-Essex County.
The detailed recountings of George the Ghost.
She's basketball influences, whatnot. Anyway, it's a very special episode. We're very happy and proud that we've got Bob in. So stay tuned for this episode of That Kingsville Podcast. That Kingsville Podcast proudly brought to you by Kingsville Brewery. Guess what, guys? Summertime is here, and they've got cerveza again.
I love summer, and I love cerveza.
Oh, jeez, it's delicious. You know that it's the perfect summertime beer. It's available at their online store, so you can order a case today at kingsvillebrewery.com, and you can take advantage of free delivery in Windsor-Essex County. So get stocked up and enjoy a nice, delicious, ice cold cerveza.
As that weather turns.
Oh, it's happening.
Thirst quenching
patios. Crack an ice cold. Squeeze a lime in that, and you think you're in Mexico. Thank you, Kingsville Brewery, for supporting That Kingsville Podcast. Welcome to That Kingsville Podcast. I'm your host, Dave Hunt. With me, Kevin Black, Steve Ianson, special guest this week. Author, former teacher, Kingsville class, Art Society of Kingsville, former president, Mr. Bob Lynch. Thanks for joining us on the podcast this week.
Well, I'm glad to be here.
Hey, we talked amongst the three of us about, who should we have on the show, and you were shortlisted months ago about being an influential, experienced person about the town of Kingsville. There's so many things that you've either had a part in, created, or documented about our town that it would be a disservice to our audience if we did not have you on the show. So thank you very much for taking the time tonight to talk with us. And
thanks for having me. Actually, when I was in Teachers College, I chose to come to Kingsville.
Well, hey.
Mississauga offered to buy my contract out from Gosfield South, and I said that I won't go because I didn't want to go to a city. I wanted to come out to Kingsville, and I've been happy since I've been here.
Oh, you've been a man around town for decades, so touching on the schooling and whatnot. So, how long were you an educator and just at Kingsville Public School, or
no? I started at Jack Minor, which they called it Gosfield South Central School.
Okay. At
that time. I started 3 years after they had closed all the individual schools, like the Marsh, Skunk Hollow there, and out the Klondike, and various schools like that. So in 1963, I started there as when it was just one strip of 6 rooms.
Wow.
And I stayed there for 2 years. And then for $100, I left there and went to Kingsville Public.
That was a lot of money.
Well, when you consider I was making $2,800 a year the first year I taught.
Yeah.
Where was God? Because I'm relatively new.
Okay.
20 years or so.
It's now called Jack Minors. It's on the third concession.
It's Jack Minor. Yeah, it's
same
the same
school.
Yeah.
They renamed it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. When they felt that they didn't like the great big long consolidated name, they went just with Jack Minors. Because he was just down the road.
Fitting tribute to a prominent Kingsville native or citizen. Yeah, right. So coming into Kingsville Public School, that's pretty much where everybody knows you from.
Yes, I was there for so long. I taught for 35 years.
Yeah, well, it's just like we were talking about before the show, both Steve and I, you were a teacher when we attended Kingsville Public School, and I think generationally there's parents and children and grandchildren that had you as a educator.
Gary, did he teach you too?
Oh,
yeah.
Man about town.
Well, and beyond that, because he's still involved at the high school level and the Kingsville class basketball level, there's three generations at least that he has had an impact on positively in some way.
Absolutely. And your wife, Linda, being an educator as well, too.
And we were in the same school for 30 years.
Right. Yeah,
which is rare.
Very, incredibly rare.
Especially nowadays.
I have been so fortunate to be able to work with so many bright young people.
Mm-hmm.
And to tell you the truth, I never really had a problem with any student.
No, I think and I'm going to speak freely about just what I learned about you when I was there for a few years. You were always warm, kind-hearted, willing to listen to students, willing to listen to kids, non-confrontational. We're gonna settle things amicably, but there never really was any kind of issues or conflicts about the way you handled business.
But I think the way he carried himself too brought on a bit of an intimidation for when you're younger and you see a Mr. Lynch kind of in the halls, and you're like, okay, you look at him, you're like, I don't want to mess with that guy. It was like Mr. Beverage and a couple others at the time, right?
Yeah.
There's a few when you're feeling kind of ornery, you'd push their buttons, but Mr. Lynch was never one of them. So,
Oh, sorry. It's just a cough. So, but yeah, so while you were at Kingsville Public School, did you foster the idea of the Kingsville class basketball while you were? Yeah. So tell us about how that all came about.
Well, I don't know exactly where it really started, except the fact I had a group of girls at that time who were really exceptional ball players. And I was also running all pro basketball camp, which was a residential camp, started in Trent University and then moved to Ridley College in St. Catharines. I did that for 10 years.
Wow.
But what happened during my tenure there, universities and some high schools started running their own summer programs, but were not residential. And that would make it a lot cheaper for parents, and kids didn't have to travel.
Mm-hmm.
But what they missed out on was having an intense group of players at one spot at one time.
Yeah.
A small little story I love to tell about being there at All Pro. So I didn't have my coaches do night duty. I did all the night duty. I walked around and checked the rooms and everything. I was checking out a gym and I heard a basketball. And it was dark. The lights were out. All the light in the gym was from the red exit lights.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And there's a girl and a guy playing one-on-one. And at first I thought it was kind of some hanky-panky going here. These two kids were in love.
Usually that's what
and I
happened
watched
in gyms.
it. I stood in the dark and watched. And I realized what was happening. They were actually playing. And I said, okay, you've got to go to bed. It's after 11. You should be in bed right now. And she said, not now. I'm winning. So
take this one from
that
me.
gives you the idea of what it was like. And we brought in, pros to spend an afternoon or an evening with the kids. And sometimes it was worthwhile and sometimes it wasn't. The pros were just there. Some pros were like, oh dear. Now, I have one of the problems of old age is names slip away from me.
It's not just old age.
It'll come to me.
I forget them too. Trust
We had this gentleman, best guard out of the Pistons. And I get up in the mornings too, to wipe off the tennis courts because we used those for basketball as well. Because we needed all the courts we could find. And here he is out on the basketball court. He'd already cleaned one off. And he was doing what he called 5-0 but net.
Oh.
And it's the very same drill we used with our grade 4s, 5s, and 6 girls this fall and this winter.
Yeah.
Where he stood in front of the net and put it in swish.
Yeah.
When he walked back to the top of the 3-point line, then he'd go around and do it on the angles and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So Isaiah Thomas.
Well, geez. Yeah,
can you believe here's this pro? And I asked him, I said, what are you out to do this? You're a pro. He said, they pay me a lot of money to not miss. And so he said, if I want a lot of money, I can't miss. I have to be practicing.
It's rules to live.
It's true.
Yeah.
So the Kingsville class thing, you discussed off air, when that started, there was only 8 organizations.
8 organizations. The closest ones to us were 2 of them in Brantford.
Kind of a,
And then there was Hamilton, had 2, I think. Ottawa, Kingston.
Incredible.
And that finishes it right there. There was nothing in London, Sarnia, Windsor. The teams in Windsor, the Valiants, and the other one, I can't remember its name, it doesn't really matter. They developed out of our program. Those kids came out to play. Then the parents said, as parents in Windsor think, it's too far to drive.
Yeah.
It's stigma. It's the county.
The worst one ever. Well, I wanted Tecumseh to come to us. Teacher at St. Anne's said, what's too far? What do you mean it's too far? I drive to you. He said, yeah, but it's further for us to drive to Kingsville than you to come here. I said to him, I hope they don't teach geography.
Or math.
Or math, yeah.
Yeah, you're right.
There's with a lot of sports now, parents are thinking that if you're going to play sports, success is playing in one of the big 4 professional leagues. Success as a hockey player is in the NHL. Success as a basketball player is playing in the NBA. When you were running Kingsville class back then, what did success look like for those kids?
Success was certainly winning. But my whole purpose was, I would like to say it was, and I believe it, that they would find success in feeling that they were contributing and that they were comfortable playing. That was the big success. I primarily did it from a high school team. I was coaching high school juniors. I took over for Tom Campbell when Tom got cancer and was not able to teach or work as a coach anymore. That was in 1983. And so because I took over from that, I also wanted success. And because Kingsville was the only place that had any teams in this area for a long time, we basically cleaned up. We truly did. We won 6 or 7 SWASs in that 19-year period that I was teaching. 1 year I couldn't coach because we were on strike. Mm-hmm. So we were off. But we had very successful seasons. We had a head start with the club team and then with All Pro the last week of the summer. Kids came in ready to play. The other schools weren't ready. And it took them all the way into the end of October to start to feel comfortable on the court. Yeah. It was the head start we got. And it was successful for us. And the kids that came out of those programs have very fond memories of playing.
Mm-hmm. I was going to ask, I think back to players I've coached and nowhere near as long as you have, but even some of those that I've spoken to, and you learn about the success in their life, and they may reference something that happened during a season. What sort of stories have you had of people coming back and saying, you know what, this season this happened and this set me on the course for life?
I've got a couple. One of the ones I think are the most important. This one. And this kind of cracks me up. I start to tear up on this. I always, after every game, when you're walking down the line shaking hands, I have picked out somebody who impressed me from the other team. And I'll just hold their hand just a second or middle second longer and say, I like the way you play. This is now probably 15, 16 years ago. I got stopped in a mall in London. the one out by the university. And a lady said, you coach in Kingsville. You coach Kingsville High School. And I said, yeah, I do. I don't know how she remembered me, but she remembered me. And she said, you saved my daughter's life. And I'm going, whoa, how did I do that? Apparently, her 13-year-old daughter was grade 9, was suicidal. She felt that she had no friends. She felt that the world was falling down around her. And when I said that simple thing without no purpose, nothing else behind it, but I did like the way she played. And her mother said to me, she came home and told me that somebody liked what she did. And the mother said I could see at that point in her eyes that her life has changed. And I went, holy mackerel.
Wow.
You know. And I think that people need to step in once in a while to other people's lives. And the other one I want to talk about, again, suicidal. I hate that word. I really do. And I hate the problems that people have with it. I just wish somebody would talk more. I was at Basketball Canada's office back when I was really heavy with basketball in Basketball Ontario as a director and stuff like that. I spent a fair amount of time with Basketball Canada as well. I wrote a program. I'll talk about that later, but with others, you know. A mother came in and asked to talk to the director because she was worried that her grade 7 daughter, who was 6'3", was being picked on, ridiculed, made fun of, and all of that stuff, and she was suicidal. At the very same time, and I wish I could say this name on this podcast, but I don't remember it. I really don't. She was from Toronto. I had seen her play for the University of Toronto. She was playing with the WNBA. She was 6'4", black model, gorgeous woman. And she overheard this mom, and she said, I think I can help. And the mom said, well, what can you do? She said, well, your daughter's tall, and she doesn't like being tall, right? And the mother said, absolutely. She said, look at me. And the woman said, you're just perfect. Like you're great. And she said, yeah, I wasn't always. But somebody got a hold of me and told me, stand up, be proud of your height. You can't change it. So the woman said, I would like to get your daughter. I'll bet she can't find clothes that fit her properly. Mother said, it's terrible. We can't. She said, I want her for a weekend. Will you give her to me for a weekend? We're going to go shopping. Because I was a model, I've got access to clothes that fit tall women.
Oh, wow.
And thin women. So she said, I want to walk into her classroom with my high heels on, making me 6'8".
Tucking through the doorway.
Or something like that. And she said, and I want to ask for her in person. And she and I are walking out of that room together.
Cool.
So it happened. I never really found out what happened to her, but I understand from second and third hand information that everything worked out for that young girl. And I am so pleased.
Bob, I'm sure those stories, like if everybody was to tell you your influence or some of your involvement, I bet you there's countless numbers, right? You've done so much, you've seen so much, you've had so much care and influence in people's lives. So these are great anecdotes.
I certainly hope so. I certainly do hope so. I would, especially because I'm dealing with young women.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's difficult. I've got 2 daughters myself. They're teenagers. I understand there's a lot of pressures that men and boys don't have. It's having good leadership, having good role models. It's
right from the scratch. I've always had a woman with me. Generally a mom. This is the time when parents never came to games, high school or club.
Right.
They never were there. Parents didn't travel with us. I had a bus license because I wanted to be able to drive the high school van. And the van was a maxi, 15 passenger. Mm-hmm. So I had to have at least an ambulance license. I figured If I have to go through that, I might as well get a full bus license.
Why not?
And I had it right up until my heart was giving me some murmurs back in the middle 2000s.
Mm-hmm.
And I received a letter from Toronto that said, you no longer have a bus license. You back to a G.
Hey.
And I wasn't using it for probably 6 or 7 years, so I didn't care. But I had the bus, and I would get a mom to ride with me. And we would go to games and put the kids up in hotels. I'd sit in the hall with the chair and my book until things settled down. And it wasn't to keep kids trapped in their rooms. People thought that. No. It was to keep people away from them so they weren't bothered.
Mm-hmm.
Because they meet people and things like that, and kids are kids. They say, I'm in a hotel room 14 or something like that.
Yeah.
Somebody may come around and knock. I'm going to make sure they didn't happen. All I want to do is protect my players.
What do you think about the explosion of interest, especially in women's basketball?
Okay.
It's because I've been a fan of the women's game for a long time too. It's not really it's the same sport fundamentals, but when you watch it, it's not. It's very different.
Thank you for saying that, because I've heard people say, well, they can't keep up to the men. It's a completely different game.
Yeah.
It is a skill game. If you watched any of the college, especially with Caitlin Clark, she had such, media presence. They were talking to her. But if you broke down what she did, her skills were almost perfect. You watched the rotation of the ball, because it must rotate in a certain pattern. So if it doesn't go in right away, it touches something, then by physics changes, and then it comes back down. Just reverses this roll. And it's called shooter's bounce, but really the shooter puts it up properly, it's going to go. But I'm not interested in how many threes she scored. It's lovely that she can do it that, because I'm a really big three-point shooter advocate. My wife's car says three-pointer on the license plate.
That's how we know it's you.
Yeah,
that or the Beaumont, either one.
Yeah, and there's the Beaumont, yeah. She passes so well. Another person that I play that's been a player for me was another Caitlin Longmire. Caitlin Longmire was one person who could thread needles with a pass. And so when one of her teammates was taking off for the basket, that ball was not passed to the player, was passed to where the player would be when the ball was there and the player was there at the same time. That's what she could do. And because of that, it was just simple layup, one after the other. But Caitlin worked at her sport, at the skills that she was required to have. And she could still pass. She could pass. And that's probably why 5 years at the University of Windsor, 5 national championships.
Hey.
1 year, 3-point shooter of the year of Canada, best 3-point shooter in Canada, are in their second year at university. So that's pretty darn good.
Yeah, can't take that away.
Yeah.
Right.
So Caitlin was somebody special.
So being an educator in the town, and now with the new school being built and the closure of Jack Minor, Kingsville Public, and Kingsville High School, you being at Jack Minor and Kingsville Public, what does this ending of the legacy of these schools kind of mean to you? I know there's controversy, and we don't have to talk about the controversy about the new school, but I mean, such pillars in our community and ceasing to carry on.
As a coach, I'm a little disappointed that from 2 schools, we'll now have 1 school. There will be roughly 1,200 elementary students at the new Kingsville High School. Okay, that's what I was told by the principal of the 2 schools, Mr. Carroll.
Yep.
That would mean that there'll only be 1 team.
Correct.
The high school students are still high school students, and the numbers aren't changing very much there. But this is the elementary section I'm talking about. And it also means that there's a lot of children won't have that chance to be on an important team, a winning team, a chance to play for their school. Because really, you can't take too many. If you take too many students, as you coaches around here, Steve will know that, you can't play them. And when you can't play them, there's this like knife sticking in your heart because it bothers you that these people are tried out, they've worked hard, and you can't give them their chance to shine. Mm-hmm. That bothers me. If I can't give them their chance to shine, it bothers me to no end. I know we can talk to them about being practice players.
Yeah.
Triano told me that at a dinner one time. We were with the men's basketball coach who Triano played for, the Olympic team.
Anyway,
Dr. Levy.
Triano turned to him and said, "We're in Cuba. I never even got on the floor. You took me to Cuba. I never got on the floor." And the coach said to him, "Well, that's because you never left any blood on the floor." Meaning you just didn't play hard enough. Mm-hmm. And he said, once you learned you could leave some blood on the floor, you got to play all the time. And I think Triano took that into the Raptors when he started coaching there.
Yeah.
And he was really after them. And there were some guys that were whining. I play defense. He says, no, you don't. Mm. If you don't want that ball bad enough, then you shouldn't be on the floor.
Right.
At that level.
Yeah.
But I remember Triano saying that, and I was kind of neat. So I brought a ball the other night to, and I missed getting Triano to sign the ball to with the little girls we were dealing with. And it had Stephen Naismith on it. Stephen Naismith is the direct grandson of the man who invented basketball. Mm-hmm. And he was at the dinner. He was sitting on my other side.
Wow. Jeez.
So we were at was a Hall of Fame.
Mm-hmm. Canadian.
Oh, yeah, Canadian Basketball Hall of Fame. So it was kind of neat to be invited to that.
Incredible.
At the time. I was kind of lucky.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Well, so speaking about being a part of things and being around things and whatnot, you're an author as well.
Okay.
Yes, I am. Gears. You're an author as well, and you've written 10 books.
Yes.
Concentrating in our community.
Yep.
So
I've done histories, local histories. Some of them are small, some of them are big. Like my first book that took 5 years to research before and I wrote it and researched at the same time. Mm-hmm. Down to the last one, which is only like 30 pages. But part of that means, like if you're talking about research, if there is nothing written, you're relying on people's memories. Mm-hmm. And one thing that happens, and anybody listening to this, please remember, try and think back to things. When somebody asks you, can you remember what it was like when you were in elementary school? Try and remember something interesting. Because I put it out in the South Point Sun. I was looking for stories because there were nothing written down. Gunther said that he had a lot of records, but when they closed the IGA, mm-hmm. the parent company came in very shortly after that without his knowledge and emptied the store. Oh, the racks and everything went on one truck. All the stuff in the office, the file cabinets were locked. Just picked up the file cabinets and threw them in dumpsters.
Oh, jeez.
So all of his records were gone. Yeah. But a lot of it was all done cash.
Yeah.
That in those days, in 65, they made as much in 1 week as I was making a year's salary.
Incredible.
And I was shocked by that. So $1 a head.
So this latest book, this 30-page book, what's the topic?
The topic is the dances.
The dances.
Held at the Pavilion, run by Gunther Funkenhauser and Ned Cossum. At that time, the town rented out the buildings and the upper park. So you could charge for people to come to picnic tables.
Aren't they doing that? Aren't they doing that again? I'm just kidding.
Well, and the charge was $600 a year.
Oh, geez.
In that time. But never know. We can't use today's time.
Yeah.
John Cubis was a counselor and a realtor. Mm-hmm. So he was trying to get somebody to take over the bathhouse that was beside the pavilion. I don't know if you ever know that, but there was a 2-story building where the opening was on the beach.
Mm-hmm.
The second story was accommodations and a snack bar that was ground level at the upper part.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So Ned Cossum, he's now 20, just out of school, a barber in Windsor. And he's home talking to his dad because his parents had a restaurant in Bell River that burned down. They had no place to live. They were renting someplace and they weren't happy. He said, I'll rent it and I'll pay for it. Full well knowing if they could rent it, if they could control the pavilion,
Mm-hmm.
they would have a right to have dances there and nobody could stop them.
Yeah.
So that's what they did. So they rented it and the parents ran the snack bar, lived upstairs. Ned was living in the city at that time in Windsor. Gunther was running the IGA in Essex, I think, ready to come to Kingsville.
Mm-hmm.
But he's still young too. He's 20. So these 2 young men started this. And they said to me, Ned said, we realized that the other dances had nothing but trouble. They had fights. Parents wouldn't let people go to the dances, stuff like that. We needed a presence. And that was the word he used. And I thought, what a great word. So we hired Rick from Harrow. Rick was an OPP, 6'8". Now I'm going to use a term that I just don't like using.
Mm-hmm.
He was a black man. I don't like using it because I don't like designating that. Rick was a nice guy and he worked hard, but he was big. When he walked around and said, I wouldn't do that, kids understood that they better not do that because it was size. And like you mentioned earlier, Steve, just me walking down the hall had a presence because I'm 6'2".
Mm-hmm.
And I'm tall. And if you're this high, a person that's 6'2" is going, you're looking up at them.
Yep.
And it makes a difference. So this guy, this Rick, was a super pal. Everybody loved him,
Mm-hmm.
but he wouldn't stand for any nonsense. So there were no fights inside.
Mm-hmm.
There might have been in the parking lot. There might have been out on the top of the grass or someplace up with the picnic tables, but there wasn't in the dances. And then, of course, the tie with CKLW was the big one. Every name that you recognize out of Motown was on stage in Kingsville. Now, the Supremes were there, but the Supremes were like 16 years old. They were just getting going. Tony Orlando and Dawn. Dawn was there. They were 2 young girls. They were 14, and they just loved singing.
Yeah.
So they asked if they could come and sing.
Yeah.
Well, they were doing covers for other people, but that didn't matter. Kids loved them anyway.
Sure. So
Aretha Franklin. There's a whole. I could go down a great big list. Even Michael Jackson was there. Michael Jackson was like 8 or 9 years old.
Yeah.
His brothers, the Jacksons, were brought to there to sing.
I didn't
By
know this at all.
CKLW. They were the 4 older brothers.
Yeah.
Michael was a late birth
Sure.
in that family.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
So, but he wanted to, he's a dancer. He was one of those kind of kids who was just in. So he would jump up on stage in front of them and do fancy dances. I wonder if he ever worked out the moonwalk right here.
Oh, Bob. So for everybody listening, Kevin, you're the radio guy here. CKLW and the legacy of
It's one of the most storied radio stations in all of North America. Yeah. The Big 8, it pounded out 100,000 watts of groundbreaking music that wasn't being played anywhere else, and is because of a local person, Rosalie Tremblay, that had the golden ear and was able to identify hits that no one else in North America was able to identify, and she made stars.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And having events in Kingsville, like Bob, like you're describing, Surfside 3 and all the other different events that Kingsville's, like, we had an unusual piece of that whole puzzle.
I grew up north of Toronto, and the majority of the people that I would be able to identify as being a legendary broadcaster started their careers at CKLW.
I would,
and that hurts me as a longtime cheer employee.
Well, I could be wrong, but I'm almost positive in saying that the Windsor, Detroit area was the start for rock and roll. I mean, that made rock and roll famous. Many times, people want to get a record on, but you're not going to get a record on a Chicago station that doesn't hardly even get out of Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody will know it. But when you had a record on the Big 8, everybody heard it so in such a large area that it became popular. And when Rosalie Tremblay got there and started playing things, I put one story and again, many of these stories were all hearsay stories, so I have no proof, which is unfortunate. But apparently Elton John flew into Windsor, and he said, "I'm only here to shake the hand of the woman who made me millions of dollars."
Oh, wow.
And the record was the promoter from his record company in England were promoting the A side of this 45. And she said, "I'm not playing that side. It's terrible. I'm going to play the B side."
Mm-hmm.
And he said, "No, the B side will never go." Well, the B side's Rocket Man.
Oh, gee.
And
I've heard that story before.
yeah, I'm sure you have, because I think it's a valid story.
Yeah.
And that's just one, but was several times
American
apparently.
Woman.
Yeah.
American Woman was
Guess Who?
Yeah, that was her. She, the Guess Who, were at that point not
Nothing.
much, and they had sent demos around and they couldn't get play anywhere. And Rosalie Tremblay was the first to ever play them, and the song was American Woman. And that's Burton Cummings came to Windsor to honor Rosalie because of the fact that she launched their career.
I think there's many, many others like that.
Yep.
I'm sure.
So some of the other books that you've written, too,
Okay.
they deal with other topics in Kingsville. We're going to just go down Park Street just a smidge, towards the dock and talk about Grovedale.
Yes. Okay.
So
Grovedale was really probably my story because I lived there. I came to town. We didn't drive in those days back and forth from the city. It's only 30 miles, but we didn't do it.
Mm-mm.
You came to where you were working and you lived there. So I boarded at the Grovedale house. I had a room and I was able to choose one of 4 rooms, and I chose the corner room, southwest corner.
Was that George's?
That's George's room.
Oh.
I didn't know that at the time, but it had 2 windows, and I just thought that was better to have 2 windows.
Yeah.
The very first night I was there, we're watching Ed Sullivan on TV with Lou Pierce, who was the operator, she and her husband Alf, but Alf didn't do much. Lou was there all the time. The pots and pans that hung from the ceiling, just on their tails, like the handles, they were banging back and forth and making all kinds of noise. And she said to me, "Bob, run downstairs and put your foot in the floor." Now, the house I was raised in, if my mother said to me, "Go do something," if I didn't do it right away, I got a knuckle upside the head. It didn't ruin me or anything like that. It just taught me that there's some things you need to do when asked.
Mm-hmm.
So I just jumped up, ran down, put my foot in the floor, and all the noise stopped. And I thought, what just happened? And so she told me that was George. He was a poltergeist.
Mm-hmm.
Not mean, just
there.
Making noise.
Well, I didn't have a suitcase. I just had a laundry basket, a wicker laundry basket with those wicker handles on each end.
Mm-hmm.
My clothes, my mother folded and ironed everything. She even ironed my underwear.
Hey.
So I had put it on the bed my first night as well. I went down to eat because I could eat off the menu. Went back up, my clothes were all over the room. So I went to Lou and I complained and said, "What's going on? Somebody's after the newbie." And she just laughed and said, "It's George. next time you feel him, and you will, just tell him to leave you alone, that you're here to stay and not bother you anymore. But he would come in my room every night. The room would get cold, and I would say, George, get out of here. I'm trying to sleep. And then the door would close. Door opening, old building, okay. Maybe, things shifted and the door just left its latch. But close again was another story. So, and I have a million stories, so I thought I'd put those together. Well, one of the things that happens to a writer, and anybody out there who's a writer who listens to this will say, yep, I know what I'm talking about. You get the book published, and somebody comes along and says, oh, I got a story for you about this and about that. And, that bothers me, but you can't get it all in.
Yeah.
So I hear stories afterwards about the ghost. Sometimes people embellish them. But when you're talking about a ghost and you believe in it, you've got to be really careful about what you say. I only say what happened to me or what I saw. I don't embellish it one bit, because I never saw a bloody hand come through the wall.
No.
Or a ghost come walking down. I just had all these situations. Only physical thing I ever saw, and it was 3 different dogs over the years at that place, because I kept going back and doing stuff. One was a curly coat lab, and he would lay right at the top of the stairs. And they're a little off. The stairs were a little offset from the hallway, but not much. I've watched that dog have his head on his paws, head come up, and watch something come down the hall. And as it got closer, the head got higher. Then I watched him turn his head and look down the stairs. All 3 dogs did that. One poodle, the hair on the back would stick up. I don't know how you get curly hair to stand up, but it did, kind of. So, that's the only real manifestations. And then there were a couple of gentlemen right near the end, before Mazadorius sold it to the town, who brought in some electronic equipment. And they said, yes, when we go into that room, the stuff goes wild. When we take it in another room, nothing happens. So that's what they told me. I wasn't there. They were spending the night. They slept in the building. At that time, Mazadorius owned it, and nobody else was living in the building. So they stayed in that building all night by themselves, 2 of them. Because nobody's lived in that building to live in it since Danny Loop bought it.
Yeah.
All right. To make it into King's Landing.
King's Landing, yeah. That's how we know it.
Yeah, that's how everybody would know it now, because that was 1980.
All right.
Yeah.
Like the Jordans, I talked to Mrs. Jordan. Mr. Jordan was passed away. And she said on the very last night that they were living, the movers were coming the next day to take their personal items out. She said, my husband went down to check all the doors, and he wanted to make sure that the crash bar was working. And that he had pulled it out enough when he went to pull it out to make sure it was going to lock in place, the whole thing came off at his hands. When he went to the front door, he grabbed the pull to make sure it was shut, and that handle came off at his hands. Basically, they were locked in the building until they could get a screwdriver or something, get themselves out. But she said, I guess George didn't want us to leave. Now, George, I did check. That's the one research I did do.
Yeah.
It became a court case at the court in Sandwich. Judge Horn was the judge at the time. The man who died in that room, in the bed that I had, not the mattress, of course, but the bedstead.
You're not that old.
Yeah. He was living with a cousin on Lansdowne. And they came to bad feelings or something, and he moved out. And he went to talk to the person who owned the Grovedale at that time and asked, could he live there, and he would pay rent and give them his $2,000 insurance policy. When he passed away, he made it out to them. That was fine.
Mm.
So when he passed away in the room, he'd been a soldier of fortune, we called it at that time. Traveled around the world, did odd jobs, fought as a mercenary here and there.
What was necessary.
Yeah, did what he could. So Elliot was the person who owned the Grovedale then. Elliot said, "That's my money." The cousin said, "No, he promised that to me. Even though I wasn't living there, he wanted it." So they went to court, the two of them. And at the court, a woman shows up, a young woman. And she said, no, that money's mine. That's my father. And nobody knew that he had a daughter living in Detroit. So the judge settled it, played Solomon, I guess, and he just said, all right, first we're going to bury him properly with all honors. Never mind what the expense is, we'll bury him. And then I'll split it 3 ways. And that's what he did. So that research I found by going through court documents.
Yeah.
Okay, that's just one of everything else is stories and my own experiences there. So that's the Grovedale house.
So one of your other books, we kind of uncovered some of that history in the 90s in Kingsville when we dug up Main Street.
Absolutely.
And discovered all the streetcar tracks.
Yes.
And a lot of people like that are new to Kingsville don't understand the Hiram Walker connection and the influence that we had in the turn of the century and the railway that we had coming to Kingsville from Windsor.
Yeah. Now, the streetcar had nothing to do with Hiram Walker.
No.
He did, his railway came out from Walkerville out to Harrow because he owned huge cranberry fields there. And then along and through Kingsville, went on to St. Thomas and joined up with the Michigan Central there and went to Niagara because they could bring goods from New York or from the tip of Lake Ontario, the western side of Lake Ontario, right to Detroit.
All the way in.
And miss, a couple of days of ship traffic. So that was a big thing, to be able to get a train working. But the streetcar came out at the same time. Everybody's building railroads away. And this was like a railway. But it was an interurban. So it's, when you think of a streetcar like you see on old programs on US TV and or you've been to Toronto and you've ridden the streetcar in Toronto.
Yeah, TTC, yeah.
Those are small. This would be, think more like a Pullman car.
Yeah.
Bigger. Because they needed to transport a lot of people. And they went for a distance, cross country as well. They rode on public land, right in the middle of streets. They rode on the side of the road on the land that they purchased. They would purchase a 12-foot wide by however the farm loan. I have deeds that say 12 feet by 1,604 feet. So they came down the west side of just Division Street. Okay. And then right in front of the Baptist church, when they climbed the hill there out of the valley, they ran in the middle of the road.
Yeah.
And then they went down to Mill Street and turned there and went over to Lansdowne and then down to Park, and they went to the barns because they were powered from the building at the top of the hill that has just come down in the last year.
Yeah, the powerhouse.
On Main Street, they ran again down the middle of the road. And then when they got to where the high school is now, they would shift to the north side of the road and ran along that to Union. Well, because of all the gullies between Union and Leamington, if you drive that, there's one here, and there's one here, and there's one here. They're just deep. It's not a great river flowing, but water's moving. And because it's soft clay and sand, it digs it down. So they had to build too many bridges. So they turned north and up to the second concession. And at that time, the second concession pretty well ended at the Ruthven Road.
Yep.
Okay. There was a little bit because of the basket factory that was there. So then they followed just below the ridge into, and then cut cross country, a little bit on an angle, going southeast, I should say, and ran almost down the middle of Margaret G. Benny School, down the main hallway of that school, really, to give you a spot, and then turned went across Erie View Cemetery, and then turned up Erie Street. They serviced Heints. They had a spur into the Heints plant, and they went all the way uptown. But they also had a spur on, they call it Mill Street Extension, where the bingo hall is, the little bingo hall there. It went and stopped there, right beside them. So they had a spur there where they kept boxcars sometimes parked because they were big and they were powerful. They could tow a boxcar as well. But they did a lot of that. So that's why this railroad was so important.
Yeah.
So it lasted, and it went just great guns until 1920. In 1920, they paved Division Road, Walker Road, and Highway 3 to St. Thomas.
Oh, wow.
Or, to Niagara. Excuse me.
Yeah.
Yes, from Windsor. So that was the first major paved road, even before Highway 2.
Here in Kingsville.
Wow.
Yeah.
Right.
So those roads paved meant that a person could get in their car now and drive out Division to Highway 3 and into Windsor without having to worry about the roads. Because up till 1920, you know what the clay's like around here.
Yeah.
You could have mush, or you could have something ruts so hard that your wheels can break because of trying to stay in the ruts that don't match up with you.
Yeah.
It was terrible driving. It might take 2 hours or more to get to Windsor.
Yeah.
Whereas you could leave downtown Kingsville, and be at Pitt and Olette in Windsor, right down by the water, in 45 minutes in comfort.
Well, there's some people that still think it takes 2 hours.
That's why they didn't want to come play basketball in Kingsville.
Yeah, exactly.
So the documentation and the collection of all these stories and these facts, Bob, you've given the townspeople or the people that are aware of what you do and what you write an insight into what was and how this town and this area and significance that we've got that might be forgotten.
Absolutely.
So was there one favorite topic that you wrote about, or was there one really stand out?
I think tobacco.
Tobacco? A lot of people don't understand how tobacco was so big.
Kingsville, Harrow, Leamington a bit, were the center for tobacco in Canada from the late 1700s. There were two groups of people who brought tobacco here. After the American Revolution, when the Kentucky and North Carolina and New York, Pennsylvania farmers, British farmers, basically, German farmers, were chased off their land because they were United Empire loyalists. The British government gave them land, 100-yard strips that ended at Union. All right. The rest of it was granted to the indigenous people. They brought the Caldwells from the States. Caldwells were not native to Canada. They came in from southern Kentucky, I think it was. I could be wrong about where they came from, but that's
the best we know.
Yeah. So these people had land along the lake to Tammisburg. The other group was escaped slaves. All right. They were tobacco farmers, many of them out of Kentucky and the Carolinas. They're experts. The slaves were experts at growing tobacco. And tobacco seed is smaller than mustard seed. I think, and when they wrote the Bible, they could have used tobacco seed instead of mustard seed, and that looks parable. Yeah. But a lot of the time, I had a young man by the name, or not a young man, an older man by the name of Fred Johnson from Harrow, told me stories about his grandfather escaping and bringing a pouch of tobacco with him. And I hung it around his neck. So he didn't have anything to carry. It just hung there, just a little pouch, and it was enough tobacco seed to get started. So he talked about that to me, and it was wonderful to hear these stories. A lot of my research is person-to-person stories, okay? Rather than going through books and books and books. I certainly do that.
Mm-hmm.
But he taught me that. And then I also talked to Don Orton. Don lives out on the 6th, and he was a tobacco farmer as well. When I asked him, how did they bale the tobacco? I mean, I understand baling, straw or hay, but I had no idea how they baled tobacco because I knew it was just the leaves and they had to do something with them. He said, well, just a second. And he went up in his loft and started rummaging around and throwing stuff aside, and he came up with a baling box.
Yeah.
And then he laid it out. I had no idea how it worked. And he showed me where you lay the string in, then you lay the paper on top of that, then you put the leaves in and you push them down or stand on them and then you put this weight on top of them, and you kept squishing them down until you felt you had enough, right at the very top. And then you closed your paper over, brought the strings out, tied the knots. And then I said, how do you get it out? He said, look, it was ingenious. It was just 2 little thumb screws. And you turned them and the sides fell down. So now you got the 4 sides down and the bale. You just picked it up and you went over and piled it on the pile. And then you put the things back up, turned the screws, and you're back to the box again. It was a wonderful thing. I had no idea because I'm a city boy, really. So learning about this. But the tobacco industry, especially from 1900 to, let's say, 1960, 1950, late 50s, was amazing in Kingsville.
Yeah.
We had 5 big packaging plants. Now, only one company made cigarettes. Okay. And that company was on the Main Street. It's where the Rap Shack is.
Oh, okay.
Okay, right there.
Yep.
That was a house. And then behind that was the 2-story tile brick building. And he made cigarettes in there. He would buy his tobacco from this extra stuff they had. And then he'd do that. And we also had, above some of the stores in town, was where they did cigars. And they would get women, housewives, would come in the evening after they had their family fed and their kids in bed. They would show up and start work at 9 o'clock and they worked till midnight. They got paid for each cigar they rolled. But when you could take home even a couple of dollars at a time when, auto workers are only making $2 an hour.
Yeah.
Well, a couple of hours of that kind of work, paid by the cigar, that was your Christmas money or your special money, And so it was a good deal. So we did make cigars, and we did do some cigarettes, but mostly they just packaged them in big hogsheads and sent them south, except for one company. And its building is still standing today. It's just being reused. Okay. The Ross Tobacco Company, John Ross, brought in 24 teenage girls from Newcastle on Tyne. They were like 18, 17, 18, 19, some 16-year-olds. Because he wanted his tobacco packaged the way he wanted his tobacco packaged. And so he did it this way. He built a steel-framed building and covered it with steel. That's the blue building on Park Street. That's now the Kingsville Brewery.
Yeah.
Right? That's the Ross Tobacco Factory.
Yeah.
The girls stayed. Many of them married Kingsville fellas. One girl married Lyle Rumble, and Rumble's a Kingsville name. So she was a Ross girl, and that's what they called them. They lived in a dormitory. Of course, lots of guys were around talking to them.
Of course.
Not,
a whole bunch of teenage girls in Kingsville that are from out of town. Why not?
Yeah, and they were all bright young people. They worked hard and they did their job. So we had these tobacco factories, and during the Depression, Kingsville was one of the few towns, basically even probably in Canada, North America, who everybody had a job pretty well. If it wasn't in the tobacco factory, it was at the gas station pumping gas. It was at the corner store, at the drugstore, whatever. Because without the people in Kingsville working, those stores wouldn't have been operating.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's economics. And tobacco did it. In the book, I never talked about the ills of tobacco. I'll let everybody else worry about it. But there's one interesting company I would like to talk about, just for a few seconds.
Sure.
It was called the Nicotine Company of Kingsville. And you're laughing. I can see this, and you're having smiles and chuckles. The guy that started it was in like a cement block 2-car garage, and he had a boiler. He would collect all the whiskey bottles from the hotels that he could get. Okay, and he went and took scrapings off the floor from all the tobacco companies. So it was their absolute waste.
Yeah.
And what he would do is, for lack of a better term, brew a tea of this stuff. You put it in, boil it, then he would strain it off and put the liquid in whiskey bottles and sell it as insect repellent and killer. So people would buy this, especially housewives who had lots of plants, and they would take a atomizer and they would fill it, the little bottle, the reservoir, and then use it, spray it around. It absolutely killed gnats and anything else, ants around. They would go around the foot of the doors, where ants were coming in, kill them completely. What's caused that company to go down was a brand new product that CIL came out with called DDT. And everybody jumped on it because it was going to be the miracle thing. Nobody realized that
cancer.
It never went away.
Yeah.
Whereas the nicotine, once it went into the ground, it was gone.
Yeah.
And it never stuck around. It just dissolved away. So it was probably the ideal insect killer.
Wow.
Only to be thwarted by Big Chem.
So that means there's some truth to the Simpsons episode with tobacco.
Yeah, probably is.
So, Bob, you working on anything now? Is there a new book in the wings? Are you doing some research? Because, again, this is your passion.
Okay.
You got so much. What's the next thing about the chapter of Kingsville?
I would like to do school bands.
Okay.
The elementary schools did bands.
Band geek.
The high schools did bands. And Buck, Norm Buchanan. I shouldn't use nicknames.
I knew who.
Yeah, I knew right away.
Yes, Norm Buchanan. Yeah.
So, Buck had so many wonderful bands. I mean, you got my son to play a French horn and play it in solo. I mean, come on, that's a hard item to play a solo of. And he took the kids all over, and because of that, people who never left Kingsville, basically, maybe went to Windsor, and that would be as far as they ever traveled, got to go to Washington and got to go to New York and
Chicago, Boston.
Boston.
Yeah.
And so you know all about it. You know exactly what I'm saying. Talking to
we could make this a 4-hour episode if you and I wanted to talk about music and the bands.
So that's my next one.
Thanks, Dave.
Yeah. Okay.
And it's sort of winning. The other one is, and the reason I'm not doing it because I can't figure out how. Right. In your life, there have been changes that you didn't look for that altered your life. You weren't planning it. Something, I'll give you an example. I wanted to go to teacher's college, but I only had a 3-option diploma from Riverside High School. Out of the blue, I get a call from Mother Gerald at Corpus Christi, which if you know that area, Riverside and Corpus Christi are like 3 blocks apart. They were pretty close, and the kids were tight. Riverside's a Catholic town, and I got thrown out of so many houses because I was Protestant. Because I'd find this gorgeous Catholic girl, and I'd go to she'd take me home, and we'd sit in the kitchen and talk, and her father would come home and say, "I don't remember you at Mass out." Yeah. So that's the life at that time, in the 50s.
Yeah.
She said, in my office, I was working in the bank then, at Royal Bank in my office. I want to talk to you. And so when I went to see her, I had no choice. She told me to be there. She said, you need a 4-option diploma. So here's what you're going to do. Take 10 tutored lessons and you write the exam at my desk. I had no choice in that matter.
Mm-hmm.
And she said, bring your transcript and we'll talk. So I ended up with a 4-option diploma.
Shaped who you are.
And went to teachers college. So I would never have been here if it wasn't for something outside. So I'm playing with that thought.
Yeah.
How many times does that happen in somebody's life?
I had one of those.
Yeah.
Did you?
I was going to take travel and tourism in college, and because my whole goal was to get paid to travel. I figured that if someone would give me money to go places, then that sounds great.
I can understand that.
And then I went and rented a movie and had a few drinks and watched Almost Famous, and I was like, man, actually being a reporter looks pretty neat. And then I was a reporter for 15 years.
Well, that's
but it was never a thought really in my mind. I had known I wanted to do radio, but it never really actually seemed like a career that would have been possible. And until that moment, like, well, I guess I'll add journalism onto the bottom of my college application, and away we went.
Yeah.
so that's what I'm just trying to how to work this out, because it's going to have to be all just stories.
Yeah.
Yeah.
100%. We've all got them. Like in the very minute details to the more significant, like you're saying.
See, it's encouraging that you're talking to me like that, because I'm sitting here thinking, I can't touch this because it's going to be too difficult to get people to talk to me about their stories. But
I think if you put out the call, I think you get, because everyone's got one of those, the sliding door moments, right? Like
I actually have several. I think my life is ruled by someone else. I think I have a fairy godmother or something sitting on my shoulder.
I'd say the same thing, right? Like for an unusual amount of things to have occurred in my own personal life for me to be where I'm at right now, I had no choice in that matter. It was, these series of events that just put me here, and I said yes. And, I'm not ever going to say that I had a clear vision of knowing this result is what I'm doing this for. You just go with the flow and say yes. So, Bob, I think it's a great idea.
Thank you. I'm going to push that one. Probably my most.
Music too. No,
I'm not going to stop the music.
No. I joked about not listening, but you're right. Like the significance of music, not only for what it gave the community for an art form, but the players, the influence that it had, and how many different school years and different influences that were all right here. That just is stories at this point. If you collect that, then people will understand and know that significance, right?
Bob, is there anything in the general knowledge of Kingsville that after doing all the research that you've done for all the books that you've done, that people have wrong? Is there anything that you can think to yourself, like what's one thing that people, for whatever reason, it's become common knowledge and it's not right?
Sundowner law. Do you know what I mean by sundowner law?
Yeah.
Sundowner law said that no black could spend a night in Kingsville. Yeah. Absolutely false.
Yeah.
Absolutely. George Washington was the name. Everybody, here looked at him because he was kind of strange. He wore a long coat, like an army greatcoat, and wandered around, told fortunes. But he built a house on the corner of Beach Street and Division on the northeast corner, where Red Apple is today. Mm-hmm. He said, somebody asked him why there. He said, I want to sit in my front porch and watch the town council spend my money. And I'll be keeping an eye on them. He owned, from the second concession to the third concession, that block of farmland. He owned that outright himself. And the center around the third concession and division was a community called Salem. It was a black community people don't know about. And those people were in and out of town. They went to stores in town. Nobody said a word. Kingsville did not prejudice those people. I think maybe they had prejudice on the same line as we all have prejudice for certain people. We don't like that person because of what they look like. We don't like that person because they're foul-mouthed. We don't like that person because they're a drunk. We're not saying we don't like that person because they're black, green, purple, green, or whatever other color you want to be. That was a viable community.
And that's interesting.
John Jacobs owned from the 3rd to the 5th on the west side, up to Miners and on down. He had a huge tract of land. He was the second most wealthy person in Gosfield in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. And he had friends. What they didn't do was produce male children. Jacobs had 4 girls. One married a black farmer in Colchester. He had his own farm, did well, a pillar of the community down there. The other 3 one went to Detroit and 2 went to Chicago to find mates. The 2 Ryers brothers and their sister never married. The sister's estate still owns the little white brick house just before the 4th concession on the west side. That little bush that's there, it's kind of an open middle with the trees around it.
Yeah.
That was where the Ryers' house was, where the boys lived. And they just never married, so they never produced any children either. But there were other families out there. The lady who lived on the corner of the 3rd concession and division on the southeast corner, by where the school is, she lived close and she'd wave to people going on especially on the streetcar. She never married either. She just came, found a spot to live. So it was a very strange community. They didn't have enough people to form stores and stuff like that. They did apply to have their own school, but there weren't enough of them to make the school viable. So they just joined the Salem School, what they called it. That was basically a more white, like an all-white school, but that didn't cause any problems either. So that's one of the big bad stories.
Misconceptions.
Yeah, misconceptions. They were citizens. And the only thing that I came across in my research was the 2 Ryers boys, when they were young, they would go to town, have a couple of drinks at the Kingsville Hotel downstairs in the basement, and then race home with their horses and buggies. And they would take up all the Division Road all the way out to the 3rd, between the 3rd and the 4th. And anybody traveling on that road at nighttime in the dark was going to get run over by their horses because they flew. So that was the only bad story. These guys were stopped several times from racing. In fact, the police in town would say, all right, get to the 2nd. You can race after the 2nd, but not before. Not before. So that's one of the things. Thanks for asking that question. Yeah. We didn't have a sundowner law. I've been through the things and Tamara.
It just
also.
I'm really glad that that's been mentioned.
Yeah,
really glad for reasons that it was mentioned not that long ago by someone.
I was gonna say
I don't want to delve into it too much, but it was referenced and it was stated that Kingsville had sundowner laws, and I'm glad that you've just made that point clear.
Well,
very clear.
I was never able to find them in any bylaw ever put down by Kingsville. And how could it be when you had a person living right in town?
Yeah. There's a difference between racism and sundowner laws. And the times back then were a different time. And if people made people feel unwelcome, unfortunately of the times, that may have been the case. But to put it in law and have a sundowner law is a different thing. That's an actual town decision to administrate something.
Now, there have been deeds written where you will not sell this to a black or a Jew.
That's a deed. That's not a town bylaw.
It's not a bylaw. That's a personal deed.
Right.
Property
And so
owner.
that's just that person being a prejudiced person.
Yeah.
But notice there's more than one prejudice there.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, Bob, and correct me if I'm wrong, but Essex and Leamington had sundowner laws, right?
I have no I cannot say truly if they do or don't. I have heard that as well.
Okay.
But I researched Kingsville
Yeah.
to prove that they didn't. And we had people living in town at that, when people said you couldn't be here, well, they were there and nobody moved them. So,
Well, Bob, I think, through the hour that we've been talking today, a little bit
I bet
more.
we talked more than an hour.
Yeah, a little bit more. But you've also carved your own place in Kingsville's history. And, this generation that got to spend it with you, and for generations from here on in, they'll know of what you've done, both, personally and what you've documented for future reference. Because if you hadn't have done some of the research and had those conversations and had those stories told to you, they'd be gone. Much like all the World War II veterans that are dying off, there's only so much time that we have in order to collect those stories and understand where we came from, what it was, right? The railways, the dances even, right? Those generations of those people that partook, they're dwindling. So, Bob, you've not only had that personal influence in town, but you've also collected it for us in order to preserve it. So thank you. Thanks for taking the time.
Can I just say one little story?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
In the military museum, there's a baseball glove. That was Fred Jasperson's. Fred Jasperson was in the prisoner of war camp that the United States made the movie of, The Great Escape.
Oh, geez.
And where the thing of Steve McQueen sitting between the huts with a baseball, throwing it off and catching. Basically, that's what Fred did. I think they just stole the whole thing and used Fred and didn't give him credit for it.
Didn't make that good of a story for the movie. Steve McQueen's doing it.
Yeah,
All right.
He's kind of important. So,
but
so that's one of the things. Yeah, they were.
Where can you get his books?
Yeah, I was gonna say is like Bob. Yeah, I'm assuming all your books are available at Kingsville Library, but where can people buy them or get them
from me?
From
Basically,
you? Just knock on your door and say, "Hey, can I get?"
No, I'm like my Mill Creek Monster is my bestseller.
Sure, yeah, that's
and it's a fiction with a whole lot of fact.
Yeah.
So, like things like the hobo camps during the winter down in Mill Creek, right there by the bridge, on where the greenway is. Yep. They were out of the wind, and it was basically a sheltered area, and they didn't bother anybody. I'm sure there was incidents where somebody stole something, or who knows. Yeah. But for the most part, they were fine, and they were down there. So that's a fact. I could put that in the book.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to jazz it up by having a little Sasquatch that invaded people's lives.
Creative license.
I guess if people are interested, they can always reach out via our social media, and we can get in touch with Bob. And,
Absolutely.
And go that way rather than maybe broadcasting his address or phone number or anything like that. But yeah, we can certainly act as a conduit.
Also, you're visible around town.
Yeah, definitely.
Again, we're incredibly happy and glad that you took the time to share it with us tonight and say tell us some of the stories.
This has been a most enjoyable time for me.
Bob,
having a great time. I just this is one of the quieter episodes I've had because I'm just
in awe.
Yeah, and taking it all in. It's been fascinating. I thought we were going to have to actually cut the episode earlier when we shared that one. No, seriously, like the first story you shared, I was like, okay, we may have to stop here. Yeah. But no, fantastic stuff.
So yeah, we're excited to hear about the next, book possibilities and the stories and running into you around town and, just shooting the breeze and find it out. So thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.